Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Israel Bible Podcast. My name is Cindy Parker. I am an author, a speaker, and the professor of Holy Land Studies at the Israel Bible Center. I am passionate about reading the Bible in the physical, historical, and cultural context of its day. And in reality, I just love having geeky conversations with people about new things. In this podcast, I'd like to invite you to join me as I sit down each week with other faculty members of IBC to discover new aspects of the Bible. These are some of my favorite dialogues because as a modern audience reading an ancient text, we know that the Bible does not need to be rewritten, but it needs to be reread. This week, we get to continue listening to a roundtable talk between Dr. Gruber and Rabbi Dr. Bejarano-Gutierrez titled Complex Jewish and Christian Identities. Last week, we talked a little bit about Cypriot Jews in Spain. This week, we listen in on how that background influences Rabbi Bejarano-Gutierrez's studies into the ancient and modern formation of Jewish identity. If something like the Spanish Inquisition can have a huge impact on Jewish identity, then surely historic events like the loss of the northern kingdom of Israel, or the destruction of the first temple, or the return of Jews to reestablish Jerusalem also had a strong impact on Jewish identity. In the Second Temple period, we have an interesting time in which Jewish identity is being formed along with this development of Christian identity. And all of this is happening within a Greco-Roman world. So it's a complex context, and I think we should start with the historic events that helped to shape Jewish identity.
One of the things that interested me at the Siegel College was Jewish identity in the Second Temple period, as you noted. And to be honest, one of the reasons I was interested in that was because I was exploring this issue of what does it mean to be a Jew? And of course, the people that I was studying with, they were from Orthodox backgrounds. There were some that were conservative, some Reform. I think one was from a Reconstructionist background. And all of them had sort of their understanding, whether it was halakha, or whether it was minhagim, customs, or, maybe history, whatever it is that they put together. And coming from a crypto-Jewish background, I sort of wanted to take that idea or those ideas and look at it from, all different perspectives. And so for me, as I began to study, I began to realize that, of course, Judaism has always been in an evolving state, developing, changing, responding to persecution, conditions, economic circumstances, and so forth. And so what I did is I went back into the biblical period and I began to ask the question, what were the links between what we would call the religion of biblical Israel or Israelite religion, and how do we get to a point where we recognize what today we would call, traditional Judaism or classical Judaism or rabbinic Judaism? And so what I did is I looked at biblical text and I looked at the centrality of the Beit HaMikdash, the temple in Jerusalem. I looked at the position of the king and the prophets and the scribes and so forth. And I began to look at events like the destruction of the first temple, the Babylonian exile, what most people talk about, the 10 lost tribes and so forth, the destruction of the northern kingdom, and the return of those individuals back into the land, and sort of the redefinition of what it meant to be an Israelite or what it meant to be Jewish, and began to trace what I felt to be the clear markers of what we would consider today to be Jewish identity. And of course, one of them was the importance of the written text, the Torah. In the book of Ezra, the book of Nehemiah, we have a very strong delineation between those who had intermarried and those who had not. So now we have the question of, the halachic basis of Jewish identity. What is it? Who is truly a Jew? Is a person that is born of a non-Jewish mother? Is that person a Jew? So we have, for the first time in the biblical text in Ezra and Nehemiah, we seem to have sort of a concrete answer, and that seems to be the basis for texts that come after that. And then I began to look at how the importance of the biblical text and how the reading and rereading and transmission of those texts created different interpretations of those texts. And so now the text, in many ways, even though the temple was standing, it became equivalent to the importance of the temple. So you have the korbanot, the sacrifices, but now people are at some level beginning to hear the stories. They're beginning to hear the cycle of the readings in some form or fashion. And now it's a question of, well, how do we live those readings out? How do we live those things out? And so then you have the emergence of different sects, right? Different groups that begin to interpret and then to live out as they understand, because in their mind, they want to live out what I would put in quotes, the true Israel, the identity of how they understood pre-exilic Israel or the Israel of the past, because I think what they're trying to do is they're trying to go back to this time in the past where they represent the true experience, the true meaning of the Jewish people, the Israelite people. And as we continue throughout the Second Temple period, with the rise of the sects that we know, I think most Christians know, and Jews, the Pharisees and the Sadducees and the community at Qumran, we begin to see a continuing development of that. And then from that point, we begin to see how important halakha, as understood by different groups, Jewish law, even when there's opposition between one sect and another, how important that is in this idea of Jewish identity. And I think that, for somebody who's familiar with the New Testament, these ideas are still there. They may take a different perspective, or there may even be conflict between different groups in the early Christian movement, but all those ideas are there, and they're sort of in an early stage of development, but you can see them beginning to flower and to develop. And I think that, if I can say that for me, the Jewish experience in the first century and beyond, it's like you have to have an understanding of Christianity, because there's a commonality there at some level, and the experience there is very porous. There's always an interaction that takes place. And so all those issues were part of the interest that I had. And of course, if you trace it throughout history, you can just sort of begin to draw a line of how those two communities interact and how they respond to each other.
And what happens when we bring Jesus into the conversation? Rabbi Dr. Bejarano-Gutierrez wrote a book that is called Forgotten Origins, The Jewish History of Jesus and Early Christianity, and another book that is titled Judaizing Jesus, A Radical Jewish Approach to Christianity. That second book reviews a variety of historic perspectives on Jesus and Christianity. Now, if you are a part of the Israel Bible Center community, the idea of a Jewish Jesus and strong Jewish thought in the Greek New Testament is not new to you. So many of our courses deal with this and take a lot of time to pull out fascinating insights when you allow the Jewishness of Scripture to speak. But when we talk about identity formation, how does the emergence of Christianity, especially with the influence it had on Gentiles, affect Jewish identity?
Well, I think that for me, again, I keep mentioning his name, Rabbi Byron Sherwin, who passed away several years ago because he was such an impact on my life. I think that one of the ideas that he communicated to me was that he saw Christianity as a conundrum, like this, this sort of confusing riddle of sorts. And on the one hand, he could appreciate what he really believed, I think, was the transformative element that this faith had on Gentiles. They had come, they had abandoned paganism. And I think if you look at many of the examples that I provide in Judaizing Jesus, and in a future volume, I hope to sort of expand that. I think many rabbis realized that they weren't dealing with the same situation as they had maybe previously or previous generations had. There had been something markedly different where these people had adopted the God of Israel in some form, and they were confronting a people that were adopting the Tanakh, the Hebrew scripture, again, in some form. And they were confused because on the one hand, they saw this transformation, but on the other hand, they also saw a supersessionism. They saw anti-Semitism, anti-Judaism. And so it was almost like it's very confusing. How can these two things exist? How can we see, even the Rambam talks about the knowledge of God being spread throughout the entire world through Christians and Muslims. And at the same time, we have these, tragic persecutions and hatred and so forth. The converso experience, the crypto-Jewish experience, is a byproduct of that anti-Semitism, of that anti-Judaism. So how can we have these two things? How can it be transformative, and yet we have these two issues, the other aspect of it? And so for me, I think what's important is we have an opportunity to understand what are the elements that have to be reconsidered. I think that in the post-Holocaust era, post-Shoah, many Christians have undertaken this consideration. There was an article even this week that the Anglican Church, the Church of England, had done a study and that they had concluded that Christian anti-Semitism had played a very significant part, in the tragedy of the 20th century. And I think that reconsideration is critically important. But at the same time, I think that many Jews also hopefully will be honest enough to look at Christians on an individual basis at the very least and say, well, what is the commonality that we have? What do we share, and what do we have to contribute to one another's understanding, so that we can perhaps in our own way truly work toward tikkun olam, the reestablishment of true order and peace. And so for me, that's sort of the issue that both sides, I think, have to reconsider, not just the Jewish elements, but also the negative aspects, the anti-Judaism, and sometimes, as uncomfortable as it may be, maybe sometimes the anti-Christian or even anti-Gentile perspectives that, understandably so, have sort of crept in. So I think those are two issues that I think are important to take away. I'll just mention that in the beginning of Judaizing Jesus, that's the latest work that I've released. I started off with just sort of personal stories of people that I had met, and I think that they were very positive because they sort of had the ability to look at things for themselves. They were very much aware of anti-Semitism, of personal bigotry that had been done against them. So they weren't in any sense unaware of that. But I think that they could appreciate individual people, individual Christians. They could sort of identify with those individuals on a one-on-one basis where they could look at positive points. And so I took that, and that turned out to be very influential in my own theological development.
If you are really interested in the Jewish responses to Christianity throughout history, you will enjoy his book, Judaizing Jesus. Now, we started this episode with a statement that Judaism has always been in an evolving state, developing, changing, responding to persecution and economic circumstances. I personally am fascinated with what people use to form identity. The historical geographer in me cannot help but see the ways in which the land we live in shapes us. Some people move above the land, oblivious to its influence on our lives. Others are intimately aware of how tightly woven human life is to the land that supports us. But people shape our identity as well. The positions and roles we have in our families, the people we pull around us in friendship groups. And then, of course, there's religion, another identity shaper. So what happens when you're forced from your land and have to live somewhere else? And in modern terms, what happens when the nation you live in turns on you and either kills you or forces you out? What happens to your identity if you are forced to convert to another religion? Towards the end of this particular roundtable talk, Dr. Gruber raised an interesting question about how Jewish identity was formed for the Jews in Spain after the Inquisition, given the sometimes competing influence of religious and national identity.
Well, I think that many of them definitely saw themselves as distinct, as a distinct people. Sometimes they would use the term la nación, the nation, or la raza, the race. And you see these in families that look for marriages between other families, even at times when the religious affiliation of that particular individual, Jewishly or not, is sort of in question. So it's more important to maintain the link to who we are as a people. And the customs and so forth are certainly part of that, but there's a sense that we have to maintain this unity, if you will. This ethnic identity is intertwined with religious belief, and so I think you see among many conversos, for descendants of conversos in the New World, one of the characterizations that comes up quite often is intermarriage. They look for cousins. They look for other family members that they can connect with because those are acceptable families. And they may not necessarily have understood what that meant in all its different details, but I think they bear this kind of memory that you're distinct. And one way to preserve that is to look for others that are of a similar background. If I could, I wanted to mention one quick reference to something you said previously about how conversos sort of went back and forth. there's an interesting story that I include in Secret Jews about, his name is Pedro de la Cabarilla, I believe, if I remember correctly. And he had converted to Christianity, and he had even written a book on a theological defense of Christianity against Jewish, perspectives or, counterattacks. And yet we find him participating in a Shabbat dinner, reciting the Birkat Hamazon, the grace after meals. And one of the individuals who was Jewish and is hosting this Shabbat dinner says, I don't understand. You, on the one hand, you're an important figure in the city, you're writing books against Judaism, and here you are, reciting Birkat Hamazon and Zemirot and things of this nature. And the individual basically says, when I was a Jew, technically, I was very restricted in what I could do. Now that I'm a Jew, technically, a Christian, technically, all the gates have been open for me. So if I want to observe Yom Kippur, if I want to, recite Birkat Hamazon, I'm free to do so. And who's going to tell me otherwise? And I thought that it's sort of comical, but I think in some sense it sort of reflects this very complicated experience.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yes, and there's a book that came out several years ago, I think, called The Mezuzah in the Madonna's Foot. And you also include this episode in your in one of your books. Do you want to just tell us briefly what that is? Because that's also a striking vignette of how traditions and identity were preserved and what it meant to be a crypto Jew sometime.
Well, the reference to the Mezuzah and the Madonna's Foot is the use of Catholic paraphernalia, statuettes, and so forth, and putting Jewish ritual objects, a Mezuzah, in a place where you essentially honor Catholic tradition or Catholic practice, but secretly, or the intent is to honor Jewish practice, or to honor the status of the Mezuzah. What I think is interesting in relation to that is that you find this fusion, not just in practical terms, like in that particular case, but you have many crypto Jews that over time began to refer to Saint Moses and many of the patriarchs in the same way that they would refer to saints within the Catholic tradition. And there's not an exact understanding of when the barriers end. The lines are drawn. It's like a mixing, and it's just sort of natural. It just becomes one that's part of the other. And I think that's also part of that development.
This is only a tiny sampling of the roundtable talk called Complex Jewish and Christian Identities. If you want to go in depth on the subject, you will find a link to the whole conversation in the show notes of this episode. Thank you for being here today. If you want to join an online community that is taking a new look at the Bible, you are most welcome to join our community at IsraelBibleCenter.com. We have a huge collection of courses, and you can combine them to earn a certificate in Jewish context and culture. Thank you to Jeremy McDonald from Mason Jar Music for doing an amazing job mixing, editing, and crafting all the good sounds you hear. And thank you for hanging out with me and being curious about all things Bible related.